Hey readers, welcome back to Reads with Room B. I hope you had a fantastic week last week. With that being said, let's get into today's chapter. TweedleDum and TweedleDee. And here is Alice meeting TweedleDum and TweedleDee in the forest. As they were standing under a tree, each with an arm around the other's neck, Alice knew which one was which in a moment, because one of them had "Dum" embroidered on his collar, and the other had "D" around his. "I suppose they've got Tweedle around the back of each collar," she said to herself. They stood so still she quite forgot they were alive, and she was just looking around the back to see if the word Tweedle really was written on the back, when she was startled by a voice coming from the one marked "Dum." "If you think we're waxworks," he said, "you really ought to pay, you know. Waxworks weren't made to be looked at for nothing. Nohow. Contrariwise," added the one marked "D, "if you think we're alive, you really ought to speak." "I'm very, very sorry," was all Alice could say, for the words of an old song kept ringing through her head like the ticking of a clock, and she could hardly help but saying them out loud. TweedleDum and TweedleDee agreed to have a battle, for TweedleDum said TweedleDee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow, as black as a tar barrel, which frightened both heroes so they quite forgot their quarrel. "I know what you're thinking about," said TweedleDum, "but it isn't so, nohow." "Contrariwise," continued TweedleDee, "if it was so, it might be, and if it were so, it would be. But as it isn't, it ain't, and that's logic." "I was thinking," said Alice very politely, which is the best way out of this wood, as it's getting so very dark. Would you please tell me?" But the fat little men only grinned at each other. They looked so exactly like a couple of great schoolboys that Alice couldn't help but point her finger at TweedleDum and say, "First boy." "Nohow," cried TweedleDum briskly, and shut his mouth with a snap. "Next boy," said Alice, passing on to TweedleDee, and she felt certain he would shout out "Contrariwise," and so he did. "You've begun all wrong," cried TweedleDum. "The first thing in a visit is to say, 'How do you do?' and shake hands." And here the two brothers gave each other a hug, and then they held out two hands that were free to shake with her. Alice did not like shaking either of them first, for fear of hurting the other one's feelings. So, as the best way out of this difficulty, she took hold of both hands at once, and the next moment they were dancing around in a ring. This seemed quite naturally, she remembered afterwards. And she was not even surprised to hear music playing. It seemed to come from the tree under which they were dancing. And it was done, as well as she could make out, by the branches of the tree rubbing across one another like fiddles and fiddlesticks. And here are Alice and the Tweedles dancing about. "But it certainly was funny," said Alice afterwards, when she was telling her sister the history of all of this, "to find myself singing 'Here we go round the mulberry bush.' I don't know when I began it, but somehow I felt as if I'd been singing it a long, long time." The other two dancers were fat, and very soon out of breath. "4 times round is enough for one dance," TweedleDum panted out. left off dancing as soon as they had begun, and the music stopped at the same moment. They both let go of Alice's hands and stood looking at her for a moment. There was rather an awkward pause, as Alice didn't know how to begin a conversation with people she had just been dancing with. It would never do to say, "How do you do now?" she said to herself. And we seem to have gotten a great deal beyond that somehow. "I hope you're not tired much," she said at last. "No, Hal, and thank you very much for asking," said Tweedledum. "So much obliged," said TweedleDee. "You like poetry?" Yes. Well, pretty well. Well, at least some poetry," she answered doubtfully. "Would you tell me which road leads out of the woods?" "What shall I repeat to her?" the TweedleDee said, looking around at Tweedledum with great solemn eyes, and not noticing Alice's question. "The Walrus and the Carpenter is the longest," Tweedledum replied, giving his brother an affectionate hug. TweedleDee began instantly. The sun was shining, and here Alice ventured to interrupt him. "If it's very long," she said politely as she could, "would you please tell me which road out first?" Tweedledum smiled gently and began again. And here we have the Walrus and the Carpenter. The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright. And this was odd because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily because she thought the sun had got no business to be there. After the day was done, it was very rude of him, she said, to come and spoil the fun. The sea was wet as wet could be, the sands were dry as dry, you could not see a cloud because there was no cloud in the sky. No birds were flying overhead, there were no birds to fly. The Walrus and the Carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If only this were cleared away, they said, that would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops slept for half a year, do you suppose, the Walrus said, that they could make it clear? I doubt it, said the Carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the Walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk, along a briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4 to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for a treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat, and this was odd because, you know, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4. Thick and fast they came at last, more and more and more, all hopping through the frothy waves and scrambling to the shore. The Walrus and the Carpenter walked on a mile or so, and then they rested on a rock conveniently low, and the little oysters stood and waited in a row. And here is the Walrus and the Carpenter sitting on the rock, and all the oysters waiting. The time has come, the Walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings. and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath, and all of us are fat. No hurry, said the carpenter, and thanked him much for that. A loaf of bread, said the walrus, is chiefly what we need. Pepper and vinegar besides are very good indeed. Now if you are ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. But not on us, the little oysters cried, turning blue. After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do. The night is fine, the walrus said. Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and all of you are very nice. The carpenter said nothing, but cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I had to ask you twice. It seems a shame, the walrus said, to play them such a trick. After all, we've brought them so far out and made them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing, but the butter spread too thick. And here are the walrus and the carpenter getting ready to eat the oysters. I weep for you, the walrus said. I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of larger size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But the answer there came none. And this was scarcely odd, because they'd eaten them, every one. And there they are, sitting on the beach after having eaten all the oysters. I like the walrus best, said Alice, because, you see, he was a little sorry for the poor oysters. He ate more than the carpenter, though, said TweedleDee. You see, he had his handkerchief in front, so the carpenter couldn't see how many he took, contrariwise. That was mean, said Alice indignantly. Then I should like the carpenter best, if he didn't eat so many as the walrus. But he ate as many as he could get, said Tweedledum. This was a puzzler. After a pause, Alice began. Well, they were both very unpleasant characters. And here she checked herself in some alarm at hearing something that sounded to her like the puffing of a large steam engine into the woods near them, and though she feared it was more likely to be some wild beast. Are there any lions or tigers hereabouts? She asked rather timidly. Oh, it's only the Red King snoring, said TweedleDee. Come and look at him, the brothers cried, and they each took one of Alice's hands and led her up to where the king was sleeping. Isn't he a lovely sight? Said Tweedledum. Alice couldn't honestly say he was. He had on a tall red nightcap with a tassel, and he was lying crumpled up into some sort of untidy heap, and snoring loudly, fit to snore his head off, as Tweedledum remarked. I'm afraid he'll catch cold with lying on the damp grass, said Alice, who was a thoughtful little girl after all. He's dreaming now, said TweedleDee. And what do you think he's dreaming about? Alice said, no one can guess that. Why, about you, TweedleDee exclaimed, clapping his hands triumphantly. And if he left off his dreaming about you, where do you suppose you would be? Where I am now, of course, said Alice. Not you, TweedleDee retorted contemptuously. You'd be nowhere. Why, you're only a sort of thing in his dream. And if that there king was to wake up, added Tweedledum, you'd go out, bang, like a candle. I shouldn't, Alice exclaimed indignantly. Besides, if I'm only sort of a thing in his dream, what are you two, I should like to know? Ditto, said Tweedledum. Ditto, ditto, cried TweedleDee. He shouted this so loud that Alice couldn't help saying, Shush, you'll wake him. I'm afraid if you make so much noise. Well, it's no use in your talking about waking him, said Tweedledee. Said Tweedledum, sorry. When you're one of the things in his dream, and you know very well you're not real. But I am real, said Alice, and began to cry. You won't make yourself any realer by crying, Tweedledee remarked. There's nothing to cry about. If I was real... My apologies. If I wasn't real, said Alice, half laughing through her tears, as it all seemed so ridiculous, I shouldn't be able to cry. And there is the king snoring. I hope you don't suppose that those are real tears, Tweedledum interrupted in a tone of great contempt. I know they're talking nonsense, thought Alice to herself, and it is foolish to cry about it. So she brushed her tears away, and went on as cheerfully as she could. At any rate, I'd better be getting out of these woods, for it really is coming on very dark. Do you think it will rain? Tweedledum spread out a large umbrella over himself and his brother, and looked up into it. No, I don't think it is, he said. At least not under here, nohow. But it may rain outside? It may, if it chooses, said Tweedledee. We've no objection, contrariwise. Selfish things, thought Alice, and just as she was going to say good night and leave them, when Tweedledum sprang out from under the umbrella and seized her by the wrist. Do you see that? He said in a voice choking with passion, and his eyes grew large and yellow all in a moment. And he pointed with a trembling finger at a small white thing lying under the tree. It's only a rattle, said Alice, after a careful examination of the little white thing. Not a rattlesnake, you know, she added hastily, thinking he was frightened. Only an old rattle, quite old and broken. I knew it was, cried Tweedledum, beginning to stamp about wildly and tear his hair. It's spoiled, of course. Here he looked at TweedleDee, who immediately sat down on the ground and tried to hide himself under the umbrella. Alice laid her hand upon his arm and said in a soothing tone, You needn't be so angry about such an old rattle. But it isn't old, cried Tweedledum in greater fury than ever. It's new, I tell you. I bought it yesterday. My nice new rattle. And his voice raised to a perfect scream. And here is Alice and the Tweedles, and it's looking very, very hairy. And all this time, Tweedledee was trying his best to fold up into the umbrella, which was an extraordinary thing to do, and it quite took Alice's attention away from the angry brother. But he couldn't succeed. And it ended in his rolling all over, bundled up in the umbrella with only his head out, and he lay there, opening and shutting his mouth, and his large eyes looking more like a fish than anything else, Alice thought. Of course you have to agree to a battle, Tweedledum said in a rather calmer tone. I suppose so, the other sulkily replied, as he crawled out of the umbrella. Only she must help us to dress, you know. And so the two brothers went off, hand in hand, into the wood, and returned in a moment with their arms full of things, such as bolsters, blankets, hearth rugs, tablecloth, dish covers, coal scuttles, and all manner of things. I hope you're good at hand pinning and tying strings, Tweedledum remarked. Every one of these things has to go on somehow or other. Alice said afterwards that she had never seen such a fuss made about anything in all her life. The way those two bustled about, and the quantity of things they put on, and the trouble they gave her in tying string and fastening buttons. Really, they'll be more like bundles of old cloth than anything else by the time they're ready, she said to herself, as she arranged a bolster around the neck of TweedleDee. To keep his head from being cut off, you know, he said. To keep my head from being cut off, you know, he said. You know, he added very gravely, it's one of the most serious things that can possibly happen in a battle, to get one's head cut off. Alice laughed loudly, but she managed to turn it into a cough for fear of hurting his feelings. Do I look very pale? Said Tweedledum, coming up to have his helmet tied on. He called it a helmet, but it certainly looked much more like a saucepan. And here is Alice with the Tweedles as they get ready to do battle. Well, yes, a little, Alice replied gently. I'm generally very brave, he went on in a low voice. Only today I have a headache. And I've got a toothache, said TweedleDee, who had overheard the remark. I'm far worse than you. Then you'd better not fight today, said Alice, thinking it a good opportunity to try and make peace. But we must have a bit of a fight. I don't care about going on long, said Tweedledum. What's the time now? TweedleDee looked at his watch and said, 4:30. Let's fight till 6 and then have dinner, said Tweedledum. Very well, said the other rather sadly. She can watch us. Only you better not come very close. I generally hit everything I can see when I get really excited. And I hit everything within reach, cried Tweedledum, whether I can see it or not. Alice laughed. Then you must hit trees pretty often, I should think, she said. Tweedledum looked around him with a satisfied smile. I don't suppose, he said, there'll be a tree left standing for ever so far around by the time we've finished. And all about a rattle, said Alice, still hoping to make them a little ashamed of fighting over such a trifle. I shouldn't have minded it so much, said Tweedledum, if it hadn't been a new one. I wish the monstrous crow would come, thought Alice. There's only one sword, you know, Tweedledum said to his brother, but you can have the umbrella. It's quite sharp. Only we must be quick, as it's getting as dark as it can be. And darker, said TweedleDee. It was getting dark so suddenly that Alice thought there must be a thunderstorm coming on. What a thick black cloud that is, she said, and how fast it comes. Why, I do believe it's got wings. It's the crow! Tweedledum cried out in a shrill voice of alarm, and two brothers took to their heels and were out of sight in a moment. Alice ran a little way into the wood and stopped under a large tree. It can never get at me here, she thought. It's far too large to squeeze itself in among the trees, but I do wish it wouldn't flap its wings so. It makes quite a hurricane in the woods. Here's somebody's shawl being blown away. And that is the end of our chapter. See you next week, readers. Be excellent. Bye for now.